started with a simple sentence. "Dad, I made a new friend." At first, I smiled. Children make new friends all the time. But after a few days, something didn't feel right. Every evening, my 8-year-old son would quietly make an extra sandwich before dinner. He'd grab a bottle of water from the refrigerator and disappear down the street. When I asked where he was going, he always gave the same answer. "I'm taking it to my friend." I asked him why his friend never came over to play. He looked at me with complete sincerity and said, "He can't come here. He's hiding." I assumed it was another imaginary friend, the kind children create when they're lonely or bored. But then my son started telling me things that made no sense. He described a boy who slept inside an abandoned house at the edge of town, a boy who was always hungry, a boy who was afraid of adults. Every detail felt too specific, too real. One evening, instead of stopping him, I decided to follow him. I stayed far enough behind so he wouldn't notice. What I found changed the way I would listen to my child forever, because waiting inside that abandoned house wasn't an imaginary friend. It was a frightened little boy who had been missing for weeks. And that night, my son's quiet act of kindness became the breakthrough that an entire town had been searching for. This is the story of how one child's compassion uncovered a truth that no adult had managed to see. It all began a few weeks after we moved into a quiet neighborhood. My 8-year-old son adapted quickly. He made friends at school, rode his bike around the block, and seemed genuinely happy. Then one evening during dinner, he casually mentioned something that caught my attention. "Dad, I met another boy today." I smiled and asked where he lived. My son simply pointed toward an old abandoned house at the end of the street. The place had been empty for years. Broken windows, overgrown grass, a roof that looked ready to collapse. Everyone in the neighborhood avoided it. I assumed he was using his imagination. Children often invent stories, so I didn't think much of it. Over the next several days, I noticed something unusual. Every evening, just before sunset, my son quietly made an extra sandwich. He would fill a small bottle of water. Sometimes he'd even take an apple or a chocolate bar from the kitchen. When I asked why he needed 2 sandwiches, he smiled and answered, "My friend gets hungry." I laughed at first, but then he added something unexpected. He says he hasn't seen his mom in a long time. The words stayed with me, not because they sounded impossible, but because they sounded painfully real. One evening, I decided not to stop him. Instead, I quietly followed from a distance. My son walked calmly down the sidewalk, crossed the empty street, and headed toward the abandoned house. He looked around carefully before slipping through a broken fence. I waited a few moments before moving closer. Then I heard voices. Not one voice, 2. My son's cheerful laughter and another child answering him. I slowly looked through a broken window. Inside, sitting on an old mattress covered with dusty blankets, was a frightened boy around the same age as my son. Thin, dirty, clearly exhausted, but alive, very much alive. The boy froze when he noticed me. Fear filled his eyes. He immediately tried to run deeper into the abandoned house. My son stepped between us. "Dad, don't scare him," he whispered. "He's been hiding because he thinks people are looking for him." After several minutes of calm conversation, the boy slowly began to speak. He had run away from home weeks earlier after experiencing abuse. He had survived by eating leftovers from trash bins and drinking water from public fountains. Every day, he hid inside the abandoned house because he believed no one would think to look there, until my son found him. Instead of being afraid, my son simply shared his lunch, day after day, without expecting anything in return. The boy didn't rescue anyone because he had a grand plan. He wasn't trying to become a hero. He wasn't searching for recognition. Every evening, he simply carried a sandwich and a bottle of water to someone who needed them. That tiny act of kindness slowly built trust, and trust gave another frightened child the courage to stay alive long enough to be found. History is filled with extraordinary stories, yet many of them begin with ordinary decisions. A conversation, a helping hand, a meal shared with a stranger. Sometimes changing someone's life begins with doing something that feels almost insignificant. This story reminds us that kindness doesn't require wealth, power, or extraordinary ability. It only requires the willingness to notice another person's pain. The father thought he was teaching his son about kindness. In the end, his son became the teacher. He reminded everyone around him that the world doesn't change only because of great leaders or dramatic moments. Sometimes it changes because one child decides that another child shouldn't be hungry. Perhaps that's why stories like this stay with us. They remind us that beneath our differences, beneath our fears, and beneath our assumptions, every human being shares the same need: to be seen, to be heard, and to know that someone cares enough to stop and help. The kindness that changed 2 lives. When people heard the story, they focused on the mystery, the abandoned house, the missing child, the weeks of unanswered questions, the incredible moment when a little boy was finally found. But that wasn't the part that stayed with me the most. What I couldn't stop thinking about was the simple kindness of an 8-year-old child. While adults searched with maps, drones, and organized rescue teams, my son searched with something much simpler: compassion. He didn't ask where the boy came from. He didn't judge his appearance. He didn't wonder whether helping him was someone else's responsibility. He simply saw another child who was scared, hungry, and alone. And every day, without telling anyone, he brought him food. Looking back, I realized that my son hadn't just saved another child's life. He changed mine, too. He reminded me that we spend so much of our lives rushing from one responsibility to another, that we often stop noticing the quiet struggles happening right in front of us. Sometimes the people who need us the most aren't asking for miracles. They're simply hoping that someone will see them. Because kindness doesn't always begin with grand gestures. Sometimes it begins with a sandwich, a bottle of water, a conversation, or simply choosing to stop and listen. The missing boy found safety. His family found hope again. And I found a lesson I will carry for the rest of my life. Never underestimate the compassion of a child. Because while adults often see danger first, children often see humanity. Perhaps the world would be a kinder place if we all remembered how to care the way children do. Not because it's easy, but because every act of kindness has the power to become someone else's turning point. Sometimes the greatest heroes are not the strongest people in the room. They're the ones who quietly choose kindness when no one else is watching. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a small act of kindness that changed your life forever? Share your story in the comments below. If you enjoy emotional true stories, psychological documentaries, and inspiring lessons about human nature, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because every story has two sides, but only one truth.
I immediately contacted the police. Within hours, officers arrived alongside paramedics and child protection workers. As they confirmed the boy's identity, one officer quietly said something that gave me chills. The child had been reported missing nearly 3 weeks earlier. Volunteers had searched parks, forests, nearby neighborhoods. Hundreds of people had looked for him. Yet somehow, the first person who truly found him was an 8-year-old boy carrying a sandwich. A few days later, after ensuring the child was safe, his family was finally notified. Watching that emotional reunion reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. Children don't judge the way adults do. They don't immediately question whether someone deserves kindness. They simply see another human being who needs help. That evening, I asked my son why he kept bringing food to someone he didn't even know. He looked at me with the simplest answer imaginable: because he looked lonely. In that moment, I realized my son hadn't just found a missing child. He had reminded me what compassion truly looks like. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can become someone else's miracle. At first, this story feels almost unbelievable. How could an 8-year-old child succeed where hundreds of adults failed? How could one simple act of kindness uncover a mystery that an entire community had been trying to solve? The answer isn't magic, it's psychology. Sometimes children don't see more than adults. They simply see differently. As adults, we constantly filter information. We judge situations based on experience, logic, and expectations. When we see an abandoned house, we think, "Stay away. It's dangerous. No one could possibly be living there." A child often sees something else: curiosity, adventure, possibility. Because children haven't yet built the same mental shortcuts that adults rely on. Psychologists call these shortcuts cognitive schemas, patterns our brains use to quickly interpret the world. They help us make fast decisions, but sometimes they also prevent us from noticing what's right in front of us. One of the most remarkable things about young children is that they often respond with empathy before suspicion. When the boy saw someone hungry, he didn't ask whether the child deserved help. He didn't wonder where he came from. He didn't question whether helping was convenient. He simply noticed another child who looked scared and hungry. Then he acted. Adults often become trapped in questions. Children often begin with compassion. That simple difference can completely change someone's life. Many parents genuinely love their children, yet it's surprisingly common for adults to dismiss what children say, not because they don't care, but because they assume children exaggerate, misunderstand, or imagine things. Most of the time, that assumption causes no harm, but occasionally it causes us to overlook something important. Listening to a child doesn't mean believing every story without question. It means remaining curious enough to ask, what if there's more to this? Curiosity can become the bridge between misunderstanding and truth.